ways to changing the practice and paradigms of agriculture and food. Time magazine identified her as an environmental hero in 2003. She received the Right Livelihood Award in 1993 and the 2010 Sydney Peace Prize. She is a founding member of the World Future Council. Dr. Shiva has argued in favor of many traditional practices, and today she is going to engage with us on indigenous knowledge systems and what we can learn from communities, especially from women. On behalf of the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs and Department of Health Sciences, I thank Dr. Shiva for accepting our invitation. Without further ado, I invite Ms. Claudia Adler to begin with the moderation. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I thought what we could start, as this is sort of a communities module, and your extensive work, Dr. Shiva, with communities, was to be able to have you sort of introduce and define community, and in this be able to kind of bring in that background on how you began to work with communities. And, you know, the first question is sort of, what is the importance of women within the community? So I'll open the floor with you. Thank you.
Yeah. So community is the basic unit of human life. We are relational beings. We are not as in society. The atomistic version of individuals is of a very recent construct. It is part of colonialism, which denied community. It is part of the rise of industrial ideology that resulted from the enclosures of the commons and the disruption and displacement of community. So over these many years, I've recognized that there are three spheres of social life. One sphere is the sphere of government. The second sphere is the sphere of business and commerce. And the third sphere is the sphere of citizens. And citizens exist as society with relationships. And those relationships are what sustain life. So basically what one could say is community is social ecology. Just like in nature, there are relationships between different elements of an ecosystem. In society, there are relationships between different parts of a social ecosystem, and binding that takes place is what forms the community. So Margaret Thatcher was very wrong when she said there is no society, there are only individuals, because that construction fits into neoliberal consumer globalized economies. I had a very dear friend called Mark Nerfin, who described this as the prince, the government, the merchant, the business, and the citizen. But citizens don't exist alone. Citizens exist in networks of relationships. That is community. What's the women's role? As industrialization, as globalization has pulled the labor of men off the land in the south into mines and into plantations, in the north into factories. Basically what it's done is it has left women to be the holders of community. And over these many years, you know, especially in the south, most resources are still held in the commons, and therefore there are communities that protect the forest, there are communities that protect the pasture land, there are communities that hold the river in commons. Communities and commons go together. And throughout the negotiations on international treaties like the climate treaty or the treaty on biodiversity conservation, I remember we would get up, or our governments would get up and talk about community rights as a unit, as the basic unit of protection and resilience and rights. And the American negotiators would go red-faced and explode with anger. There is no community, like Margaret Thatcher said, there is no community. So community is our collective strength. Community is our collective organization, not on the basis of hierarchy, but on the organizing principle of the commons, of the common good, the common sustenance.
And with sort of this definition, sort of how did you begin sort of your work with communities? How did it sort of start?
Well, you know, I never saw myself as an isolated creature. I always saw myself as part of the community of the forest, you know, not outside the forest. And when I saw the forest start to disappear, and it affected me deeply, it was like, you know, someone amputates your arm or someone chops off your leg. And for me, a disappearance of a forest that is such an intimate part of my growing up is like the cutting off of part of me. And that's when I committed myself to protect the forests of my region in the Himalaya. And I found out about Chipko. And I was at that time a student, going to Canada to be a PhD student at the University of Western, first at the University of Guelph, then at the University of Western Ontario, to do a PhD in the foundations of quantum theory. So I could not cancel my flight. I couldn't delay my joining, but I made a commitment. I would come back in every vacation, and I volunteered. I volunteered till we stopped the logging in the Himalaya. But in the process, I also realized that the Himalayan forest was not the first Chipko. The first Chipko, and let me tell you what the word means. The word means to hug, to be one with. Yeah. So the idea of Chipko is we are one of the forest, and the forest sustains us. The forests are our mothers. These are not timber mines. They are the sources of our water, our soil, our breath, our oxygen. And this was high science. These days they talk about ecological functions of forestry, ecological functions of ecosystems. Well, the women were talking this in the 70s. Women who'd never been to school, women who'd never been to university were teaching us what ecology is. And I always say I did a PhD in the foundations of quantum theory at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. My PhD on ecology and biodiversity at the University of Chipko. And my professors have been the forests themselves, but of course the women of the forest. So the idea of Chipko is oneness. The idea of Chipko is we will sacrifice our lives. You'll have to kill us with your axe before you kill the tree. And this had actually happened 300 years ago in an area in Rajasthan, which is a desert. And deserts are very fragile ecosystems, as are mountains. And deforestation in the mountains means floods and landslides, and which is why the women rose. Absence of trees in the desert means very strong desertification. So there had been a saint who had said there's only one religion, the religion of the earth, protect nature. And he wrote 29 rules, Bish Noi, Bis 20, Noi 9. The 29 rules is the religion of a large part of Rajasthan. I don't think there are many places in the world where the written code of conduct is a creed based on nature's protection. And, you know, the king's men came to chop the trees to fire the lime to make, a lime paint for the palaces. And Amrita Devi, who's a Bishnoi, has held this beautiful tree, the Kejri tree, which is a keystone species. She said, well, you'll have to cut my neck before you cut the tree. And the soldiers cut her neck. Then her two daughters came and they cut. More than 270 people sacrificed their lives in the first Chipko. And I feel very blessed that this year, or last year, I was given the Amrita Devi Award by the Bishnoi community of Rajasthan from a university of Jodhpur. So these are not just the concepts, you know, it's more than a concept. The concept is we are one with the nature, We depend on forests and trees, and we have to protect them. But it's also a commitment to action. And where does that commitment come from? A deep love, just like a mother would defend her child against all kinds of odds. That is the way the women of ordinary villages in the Himalayan Rajasthan developed the amazing power and energy to stand against the worst of violence through nonviolence. And they stopped the destruction. They sacrificed their lives in Rajasthan, but they stopped the destruction. We got a logging ban in the Himalaya in 1981. In Rajasthan, after this tragedy, the king ruled that no one will ever cut a khejri tree ever again. So its sacredness and its inviolability was recognized. So the power of Chipko is not just historic. Every action of young people in India today to protect urban forests, prevent chopping down of beautiful banyan trees around Gandhi's ashram and Sevagram, they all call themselves Chipko. Chipko has become a name for the love for nature, protection of nature, defense of nature against the worst of odds.
And, in sort of following on from the Chipko concept, in your book, Staying Alive, Women, Ecology and Development, which I've read and it's phenomenal, you discuss the violence of the Green Revolution and the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems in the name of development. Are we seeing a pushback on Western development policy?
Well, the idea of a Western development policy is a bit of a strange idea, because the word development is the evolution of a living being, a fetus, adult, a seed developed tree. So living systems develop. It was, I think, Robert McNamara who renamed countries like ours, which were ex-colonies, and instead of saying they've been drained all their wealth and therefore we need to do reparations, they said these countries are underdeveloped and they have to become more like us, and they have to take loans from us and get into debt to us. And this rent extraction system is what is called development. This is what the World Bank gets loan for. The Bretton Woods Institution, World Bank, IMF, and the GATT, which became the World Trade Organization, were created in 1944 to recolonize the third world, because they could see that we are fighting for our freedom and we will not be part of an empire. So they said, oh, how do we keep them enslaved? So the idea of development, and we have a very, very good book on which I've contributed the chapter on resources and nature. It was inspired by Ivan Illich, an amazing thinker who's no more, but Wolfgang Sachs edited it. He's a development thinker. Please read the book Development Dictionary to understand the roots of Western development. So when you say, is there a rejection of it? It was never accepted. Take any project of the World Bank, from the Narmada Dam to the imposing of the Green Revolution on India, to the structural adjustment programs of 1991, which framed 3 laws, which were sadly only implemented during the COVID lockdown, because democratically they were always rejected in our parliament. They tried and tried and tried from 91 onwards, but it's only in 2020, during the lockdown, and through an ordinance route they were introduced. And you might have seen the news of Indian farmers, 14 months on protests, fighting against laws that would hand over agriculture to corporations. For them, that idea of development is slavery. For them, that idea of development is recolonization. And there is resistance everywhere in the world. In 1985, the ecologist had a special issue on the World Bank. Every disastrous project in the world, whether it be a highway through the Amazon, or transmigration in Indonesia, or the Narmada Dam in India, or huge stocking of animals for export of meat in Botswana, all of these were World Bank funded. So the wrong thing, pushing chemical fertilizers and pesticides on India was World Bank funded. pushing large dams, World Bank funded, pushing plastics. We were called underdeveloped for not having plastics. And now everyone is tearing their hair out and saying, how do we get rid of plastics? So the idea of development has to be questioned. The development dictionary is a brilliant place to begin. And the idea of self-evolution as organized communities, protecting nature, protecting their rights and the resources and the commons, and meeting their needs according to the sustainability criteria, that this is true development.
Sort of in your discussion with the CHIPCO concept, you talk about this idea of sort of care and, inclusivity into HUG, for example. For those that are listening and, for our students, looking at communities and understanding how best to sort of work with communities, how do we go back to sort of this feminine principle, and what would governance look like from this perspective?
Thank you. So, the feminine principle actually has two levels to it. One is the cosmological principle in Indian cosmology, that the creative power of the universe is a feminine creative power, Shakti, the power to create. But the feminine principle is also in everyday life, the fact that we are all here because we had mothering, not a biological mother. We could be adopted, we could be foster children, we could have fathers who were the ones who brought us up, but the act of caring is mothering. Yeah. And Alice Walker, a brilliant writer, once said, it is time, she was with me at a conference, and she said, it is now time for us to mother Earth. Yeah. We recognize we depend on the earth, she's the mother, but now caring for the earth is mothering the earth. So we will have to, learn mothering, each of us. Number two, we have to cultivate community. Communities have been consciously broken and ruptured through liberal ideology, through capitalist consumerist economic organizing, through colonization and enclosures of the commons. These are all destruction of community. But as any of you would have seen and known, during this lockdown, if you did not have a support system, you could not have survived. And that support system is the community. So we have to consciously cultivate community. And for the young people, let me just say, we are in this COVID period. We are in this period where all the corporations are taking patents on digital currency and human patents on us being users, and we'll be allocated cryptocurrency as our value, like the social credit system that is already in place in China. So at this point of time, currency as we knew it, money as we knew it, is disappearing. So we have to reclaim the true currencies of life. I have said food is the currency of life, because currency is that which flows. Breath is the currency of life. Water is the currency of life, because these flow through systems. And the community is, of course, human communities, but human communities are embedded in earth communities. And communities are shaped by mutuality to give support to each other. So we will only have a future as a human species if we remember that we are part and a part of Earth community. And I've talked about this as being part of Earth family, as practicing Earth democracy, as a democracy of all life. And the second is we have to get out of this false construction that we are individuals floating in loneliness, all alone. No, we've got to not only start looking at what is it that supports me, the tree that gives me oxygen, my neighborhood that cares for me, my friends who are there for me, not the fictitious friends on Mr. Facebook Zuckerberg's fictitious empire and now becoming metaverse, but the real friends who are there when you fall ill, who are there to make sure that if you couldn't go pick up your groceries, they're there to help you. Friends who can have you over for joy and laughter and conviviality. And So reclaiming the commons, cultivating community and recognizing community is what we need to do as human species in times of extinction, times of collapse. And it is not a luxury, it's a social, ecological imperative.
That's fantastic. And just sort of our final question before we open for a discussion with sort of our students to ask questions is regards to sustainability, and really sort of what does sustainability really mean, and why are those driving the agenda predominantly consumer-driven Western societies? So we see sort of that hypocrisy there. So really, what does sustainability really mean?
Yeah. Sustain, of course, literally means that which supports. But usually the ones who are defining sustainability are not supporting anything but extractive. Yeah? They are building large extractive empires. And I'll give you an example of how much the double speak of sustainability can be perverted. So as some of you might know, I have spent a long time protecting seeds, resisting the false narratives of GMOs, and definitely saying no to patenting of life, because life is not invented by a Monsanto. At a certain point in my mailbox, I found a document that had been sent by one of the shareholders of Monsanto, because this sustainability program had come for a vote. And this person wanted my advice. These were days before internet and Gmail and all. Yeah? And this mail arrives in me. And it's a sustainability program of Monsanto's water program. And the program is actually saying, well, so far we married chemicals to seed and we sold more Roundup. And now if we marry chemical seeds and water, we can control the water, we can control more chemicals, we can control and own the seed, and we can control agriculture overall. And then they said, because water is getting polluted and depleted, entering into a water market is sustainable profits for us. We will always make money. So Monsanto redefined sustainability as control and ownership over a vital resource, the commons of water, and it's an enclosure of the commons, and then said sustainability of their profits is sustainability, not the sustainability of the water, the farmer, the soil, the seed, the bee, the earthworm. So sustainability can mean new ways to make more money out of the problems caused. And if any of you have followed the COP26, most of the solutions that came out are non-solution. Like net zero. Net zero says, I'll keep polluting, and now I'll also take control of your land as carbon sinks, as offsets, and I will do a sustainability solution of net zero through making money out of carbon trading and carbon credits. That is not an ecological flow of healing the broken carbon cycle. Yeah? Ecology is ecology. What matters is flows of resources, energy, materials. Are you stopping the extraction of fossil fuels? And are you allowing the regeneration through soil, biodiversity, the kind of work we do in Navdanya? And please do go and look at the Navdanya Earth University courses that we offer to go deeper into this. We offer a course in October on the A to Z of the returning to the earth, how you solve every problem: climate, species extinction, hunger, poverty, disease, ill health, through doing the right kind of farming according to the laws of the earth. So just like for Monsanto, owning and privatizing water was a sustainable profit system, for those who are selling net zero options are basically looking for limitless money to be made out of fictitious exchange and trade. And the funny thing is, COP happened and all of the giants, the BlackRocks, the McKinseys, were already with the financial calculus, not the ecological system, a financial calculus. And that's the confusion. It's an ontological confusion of taking nature and her real flows that sustain life and create the infrastructure of life, and mixing it up with money, which only flows upwards to the billionaires and to the BlackRocks. So and given the polarization we are living through, I don't have to tell you, in every one of our societies, the evidence is there. The billionaires became richer by trillions of dollars. The poor fell through the cracks, the little bit they had. And I watch how the price of fuel is making heating of homes impossible in England. So we are in a survival crisis in a serious, serious way. We cannot look towards fictitious sustainability. We have to build true sustainability, which is within the ecological processes and the ecological limits of nature and the social needs and the human rights of human being in community.
If I could invite Janica and sort of any questions now from our students.
Yeah, please raise your hand and you can directly ask the question, or you can type your question in the chat box. So I think while other questions, there's something to think about, because like from a humanitarian angle here is that there is this idea that we need to go and save the communities and we need to go and help them, we need to save their lives and so on. What's your opinion about the humanitarian interventions happening across the world today? Not just the conflicts, but also with disasters.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole book a friend of mine, Naomi Klein, has written called Disaster Capitalism, and we cannot ignore it. Haiti had a terrible earthquake and the GMO industry was there to push GMO seeds. The same after Iraq war, yeah. Order 81, I think it was, that said local seeds would be illegal and only corporate seeds would be allowed. So very often, so-called disaster intervention ends up being finding new markets. And that means a double tragedy. Yeah. So I save seeds, and we have created community seed banks. And after every disaster, our community seed banks are able to support communities to rebuild their agriculture. So we have saved salt-tolerant rices, and every time the cyclones come, those who are growing it are able to grow a crop, but those who weren't are able to take the salt-tolerant seeds and grow back a crop in the next season, because the salt has made it impossible to grow other varieties. Now, can you imagine if this seed was patented? There's a disaster that comes. The farmer has already lost everything, but now they get into debt and they get into the next spiral of disaster, which is the debt disaster. And if you've heard of farmer suicides in India, 400,000 farmer suicide, or most of them in the cotton belt, most of them because of debt and dependency for seed on one company for the BT cotton seed. So disaster intervention that turns out to be new market opportunities and profit opportunities for a few giant players is not humanitarian. It's just intervention of greed. Humanitarian intervention has to be community to community, based on solidarity, based on respect of human rights, based on respect of listening to the community that has been harmed. What do you need? Rather than bringing my recipes, what do you need? How can I serve? That is humanitarian.
Thank you very much. And Sheila, you had your hand raised. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, no, I think the response that was given, I think, cuts across about what I really wanted to emphasize as well within the humanitarian, because I think building trust is one of the core things. And I think looking at your experience from how you started, it just shows that you've really been developing the skills. And I think you've partially touched what I wanted, is because like community to community, I really like that, because I think when you do that, you kind of listen and building. So partially you addressed the question that I had, that I think in a very practical way on how you look at it. Thank you.
Janet, let me just follow up on that intervention that, I have been at so many high-level platforms where either on the one hand, there's an attempt to define the climate disaster as a new profit opportunity, or there's an attempt to define it as a new security threat. And when you define it as a new security threat, you're basically telling the people who are victims of climate injustice, most of in my Himalayan region, people don't use fossil fuels. They did not cause climate change, but they are suffering. The snow melt, the disappearance of glaciers, the floods and landslides that comes from it. And the women in the coastal areas did not cause climate change, and the repeated cyclones that are hitting our Bay of Bengal coast. So the victims of climate injustice are now defined as the new threat, the new terror threat. And the only way they can be managed is by more military intervention. This definitely I have witnessed with my own, I teach at the National Defense College once a year on environmental issues. And we get people, generals, brigadiers from all over the world. And I showed, that the crisis of Lake Chad is a crisis of commercial greed, diverting 80% of the water out of the lake to grow commodities. Then you have drought and the lake totally dries up. When the lake dries up, you have conflicts between pastoralists, settled farmers, fish folk. But these are turned into religious conflicts. And in any case, people start to migrate when their land is destroyed. The Syrian war, people start to become destitute and refugees. And very often the solution is a military intervention. And when I was teaching this course, this brigadier from Nigeria said, Dr. Shiva is so right. There is no military solution to an ecological disaster. There's only a community solution of regenerating systems in togetherness. And that's why it's, I think the highest humanitarian efforts of today in the period of collapse have to be healing the earth in our collectivity, knowing we are part of the earth, and knowing that the earth has power to regenerate and we have the power to regenerate. And through that, re-establishing and making peace with the earth, rather than allowing our disaster moment to slip into a new level of militarization and violence against innocent people. I'm watching how people have lost homes. I don't know about England, but Canada, US, people have lost homes during the COVID lockdowns. They've lost jobs, they've lost homes, they're unhoused, as they say. And they're on the streets in tents, and they're being attacked by police. That's a military intervention for those who were made homeless by economic disaster, which is a health disaster. So I think we have to be very cautious to not lose our humanity in this period of deep crisis.
Thank you. I'll pick a question from the chat. Claire is asking, I was just wondering if there were similar teachings and messages within communities of Celtic women in Ireland or the other Celtic nations as to the ones you spoke about.
Well, I don't know the Celtic nations too intimately, but I have a little sense of the Celtic cultures. I think all pre-industrial cultures have a sense that they're part of the earth, two, that they have therefore to be non-violent in their relationships, and three, women are the keepers of this culture. And so they have a very high status in pre-industrial society. And all the archaeological work showing that before wars and colonization, etc., Europe was largely a goddess culture. And the ancient sites only have goddesses and they have no arms. They don't have male gods and they don't have military arms. So the goddess cultures were cultures of peace. And so much of the history has been so fabricated to make colonization look natural, superiority look natural, extraction look better. Race knows how to make money out of taking the minerals and taking the gold and taking the spices. I think we have to reclaim our histories in authenticity, to reclaim our deep humanity, as I said.
Nisa, you have raised your hand, so you can ask your question now.
Thank you, Dr. Janika, and thank you, Dr. Vandana. My question is with regards to community, and it's something that I truly see here in Lebanon, this move from collectivism, if one might say, to a more individualistic society, which is something that I don't think Lebanese people can afford, and is ultimately not ideal in the long run. So my question is, how in your own opinion, do you revive community? And would you say that family is key to the revival of community? Thank you.
Yeah. You know, family itself, of course, has been deeply brutalized with the imposition of patriarchy. Family doesn't mean patriarchy. They're patriarchal families and their communities. Yeah. And, you know, the communities, families that can live together 100. I mean, if you look at the long houses of Borneo, you know, hundreds of people live together in the tribal areas of India. You know, the family is not a nuclear family. It's again part of the artificial construct. The community is the family. And as I've always said in my book, Earth Democracy, my life, my work with our communities, is our first communities of the earth. We are members of an earth family. And then there are communities of human beings in particular places. So the dismemberment of community is necessary to create opportunity for making money. Now, if I can join hands with my neighbor and build a house, I don't need money for building a house. Our collective strength builds the house. How have we dealt with this? The most marginal women who work with Navdanya, please go to the website of navdanya.org and find out more of what we do, how we build community. You know, women who don't have land have joined together and are working on land that they lease together and have reclaimed community at a time where agriculture is so distorted, the costs of inputs are high, the costs of labor are high. Yet together 20 women can create a miracle by working together. They don't need money, they reclaim their seeds, they have abundant produce, they have no hunger, and they even sometimes earn an income by selling the surplus. So community is the alternative to the economy of greed. And the culture of fear, I would add, because fear comes from loneliness and isolation. And courage comes from solidarity and compassion.
Thank you very much. I'll pick another question from the chat box. Hussam is asking, how do you envision the relationship between the community and individual identity, considering the migration movements and individual willingness to explore opportunities in different countries around the world?
Recognizing that there has been migration, recognizing that the person who migrates was part of a community and now is part of another community, we can create new communities by not looking at how my skin color is different from someone else's skin color, of how my religion is different from someone else's religion, but looking at the commonality of place, the street I live, the garden I can grow together. So from the earth, from the place, we get a common earth identity. And it doesn't matter whether it is in cohesive communities of village society, or it is in the new communities of displaced people. But I have watched again and again and again how displaced people survive together. You know, people in refugee camps, you think they don't create community? Just go do a study. Even in the most brutal conditions of refugee camps, people create lives, they create communities.
Okay. Rabia, you have raised your hand. You can ask your question now.
Hi everyone. Can you please confirm if you all can hear me, because I'm traveling right now. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much, ma'am, for the valuable insights. I really adore what you're saying regarding the communities. May I ask a question regarding the dynamics which we as humanitarian practitioners follow at times? For example, do you feel that when we support certain communities in the time of disasters, I believe that communities themselves can heal, they have that capacity, but if we support them through various activities and interventions and like cash injection, so do we make them more dependent, or do we add that layer of sometimes do we add that layer of conflict, or do we subject them to certain uh, non-positive dynamics of the community? Because sometimes we support one community and we do not support the adjacent community, that may create a rift between them. And then again, I believe that at certain times when communities do self-healing, as you said, and they work on their own, working together, sometimes we are facing that backlash from the funding organizations, that why the communities, for example, let's say if we are giving cash to certain community, and out of that cash they are supposed to buy food, but they think that if they make a certain contribution within themselves and they build a school, I think this is a good example of community good relations. But then the donors give us a backlash saying that the money was not well spent by the community, we did not do proper mobilization of the community. How do you see that part?
Well, you know, for one, please read my book, Oneness versus 1%, which I've written. Basically, when I watched the billionaires start to run the climate negotiations and solutions in Paris, you know, Bill Gates and Zuckerberg were on the stage with heads of state. And I said, something is shifted. You know, governance has moved out of the hands of governments whom we elect into the hands of billionaires we don't. And this domination of money and big money. I've written a book called Oneness versus 1%. I think it's the New Internationalist has published it in the UK. And just next week, there's going to be a new book released written by many movements that work on vital issues of health and agriculture and climate. And it's called Philanthrocapitalism, Origin of Democracy. It's basically about the bigger foundation. So I already mentioned this. I think reducing life is the first big ontological, because life is life. And in a disaster, what has been shattered is life. Yeah, the ability to live, the ability to have education, the ability to have homes, the ability to have food. And of course, what is the highest priority must come from the people who have suffered. Yeah, I always believe that when you have been a victim of a disaster, you are the one who really knows where the shoe is pinching. Someone else can't. But because we got into this very funny situation of the treadmill of making money, it's like you can't get off it. And even in a disaster, instead of thinking with compassion, what do people need? What are they asking for? You think of how can I impose where I have something ready for making the next money. You know, I have GMO food that has been bought by the World Food Program and that must be now distributed. So the whole package is ready. And what I find so strange is just in these last 5 years, I have watched the accounting firms decide what humanity should do. Yeah. And their impact analysis and their very fixed box things and what's doable and what's not doable. And every compassionate act of solidarity is treated as a bad accounting. But good accounting that is working against life is not going to help. And we are in a downhill process of ecological democracy, social democracy, more and more victims. You know, the figures say that 700 million people are going to be in refugee camps. Now, if that's going to be the amount of people who will need support, surely we need to be looking for more democratic ways to allow them to rebuild their lives. And I don't think it's going to be easy because, you know, as they say, money makes the mayor go round. Not in my world. Money should be a catalyst. Money should be provided by those who have it to those who don't, as a catalyst of help, with permission. Always seek consent. You know, just like in areas where there is harm, we know you cannot do something without the consent of people. I also believe that because money making is so addictive, asking the people, asking should be a requirement, and your community of young people working in human rights and humanitarian aid should start putting this discourse out. You know, having worked so very long on ecology, on so many issues, I realize that never is there an instant, you know, I do something today, I write something today. It's not that tomorrow something can happen, but what you do today will shape the future. So sometimes you have to tolerate stupidity. You have to tolerate the wrong thing, but never lose your truth and never lose your compassion.
Thank you very much. And Smriti has a question. First, she says, thank you, Dr. Shiva. Could you share your thoughts on how systems of self-reliance fit within a globalized world? Are these contradictory, complementary, or another relationship?
Well, as I said right in the beginning, there are three units. Yeah. There's a unit of governance through government, there's a unit of business, money making, and there's a unit of community and society in society. Societies work on the rule of self-reliance and self-rule. Gandhi called it Swaraj. I've talked about it in my book, Oneness versus 1%. Any living system, and communities are living systems. Yeah. States are constructs, they're not living systems. Corporations are constructs. They're a piece of paper that give a group of individual, a legal entity to be a person, but it's not a person. A corporation is not a person. A corporation is not a human being. East India Company was 300 merchant adventurers of England who got the Queen to give them rights that no human being could ever have had, to invade other countries, to plunder, to have armies. And that's how our parts of the world became their property. So basically, community is our basic unit, and self-organization and self-rule is the basic principle of existence of any living system, including communities. So self-reliance is the foundational principle. You have globalization that could have gone two ways: build on communities and then have trade like we used to. We used to supply spices. Yeah. If Janak is from Sri Lanka, his land, our land used to supply spices to the world. And we got wealth in return. And we were wealthy as long as there was justice. But the East India Company created free trade, and they took our wealth and stopped paying, and instead started collecting rents for the land that was ours, which they declared became theirs. They became the landlords and landowners. So that's how, you know, $45 trillion was transferred from India to England during the British rule. That's a huge amount of money. That makes the difference between our poverty and the wealth of England. So our self-reliance was destroyed, including determining trade as a self-reliant system. I'll decide the price of pepper. I will decide the use of my land. Corporate rule as globalization is inconsistent with self-reliance. But globalization based on democracy, sovereignty, and community can be consistent with it. And that's why, you know, we've been part of the International Forum on Globalization. which changed the discourse on globalization. And we stopped the WTO in Seattle. And with my own government and my own parliament, I wrote laws to say, no, the rights of the earth community have to be respected. You cannot have a patent on a plant, an animal, and seed because you don't invent it. Those are the kind of laws we wrote. So our laws, even in the period of globalization, became rights of the defense of earth community and local communities to their biodiversity, their knowledge. This is what the Convention on Biological Diversity is about. This is what the Nagoya Protocol is about. So all of these international treaties flow out of self-reliance and sovereignty and democratic rights of local communities and sovereignties of local communities and national governments. So, how we make the fit is what decides whether we have democracy or its absence.
Thank you. Isaac, you have a question. You raised your hand before. You can ask your question now.
Thank you so much. I'm Isaac from Uganda, and indeed I've seen the impact of the reinventing of our communities to pay allegiance mostly to the billionaires. I've seen the transformation from us owning seed to us actually depending on a lot of the seed companies and also the chemical companies in Africa. And we are trying to reinvent the wheel and go back to the core principles that actually built our communities on sharing. And we are facing a lot of challenges when it comes to building cooperatives. We have seen also the laws that are sneaked into the system and to ensure that they deprive the communities into building strong cooperatives. How have you gone about that in India? I've been following you for a long time, seeing the good work that you're doing. And we see the challenges here in Africa. I think there's a lot of shift to take over Africa in that regard. So how have you managed to build such communities in India? Thank you.
So I started saving seeds in 1987 when I heard the chemical companies say we'll now own the seed through genetic engineering and patenting and an international treaty, CAT, and its intellectual property agreements. So what we did was, originally I personally would go village to village and then we build the community, and Navdanya, the movement I keep referring to, grew out of that. We built community seed banks. Now, community seed banks are the continued practice of saving and sharing seed as the fundamental way in which communities have had seeds, bred seeds, and never run out of seed. So a community seed bank is a reclaiming of the commons of seed. This is not necessarily a cooperative. A cooperative is a legal entity. Community seed bank is a community entity. We talked earlier about self-reliance. Self-reliance is not just economic, it's also about governance. I have, had to deal with the small traders of India all panicking because Walmart was coming in, and they had adopted the language of the unorganized sector. If I have a little shop, I'm an unorganized sector. If I'm a little vegetable vendor going down the streets, I said, no, you're not unorganized, you're self-organized. To be self-organized means that you, with community, not as a rogue individual, but with community, set the community rules of how to cooperate, how to respect each other's ecological and economic space. So the way we have created community seed banks is we have built on what the people had, knew, and defended it. We've created 150 community seed banks. A big part of the community seed bank is to not lose the culture of caring and not lose the culture of sharing, because these are the two foundational values of economies of the future if humanity has to survive. These 150 community seed banks make seeds available to the communities, not as a commodity, not as a property, but as a commons. And because you're from Uganda, Isaac, I've been there to deal with globalization and GATT. Your ministers had called me way back. And I was fascinated with the fact that Uganda is the only country in the world whose staple is not rice and wheat and corn, but the banana. The banana. Thousands of varieties, breakfast banana, lunch banana, dinner banana. And then I've had to be in touch again, which is in Uganda, because Mr. Bill Gates, who loves to do everything wrong with all his big money, he wanted to genetically engineer the banana. In India, he said it's to end death in childbirth by putting iron in banana. I said, we don't eat banana for iron. We have hundreds and thousands of greens we eat for iron. We eat banana for potassium and other things. So they ran to Uganda. We threw them out. So they then ran to Uganda and said, oh, now it's for vitamin A deficiency. So my work over these decades have taught me that there's a greedy who never know when enough is enough. And they want to turn everything into a commodity, extraction, rent collection. And then there are communities who know enoughness. And through sharing, they create abundance. That is the principle of nature. That is the principle of community. And that is the principle that you should grow. And, you know, I've built over these years an Earth University. As I mentioned, we offer courses through COVID, it has been on Zoom, but now it's opening up and physically people have started to come. And we've had Ugandans come and train at the Navdanya Beach Vidyapeeth at the Navdanya Earth University. And we'd be very happy to share how you rebuild community around biodiversity and seed, around food, around ecosystems. And our research is showing farmers earn 10 times more by being self-reliant and not depending on chemicals and purchased seeds. So this is the economy of prosperity. We have been fooled during colonization that we were primitive. We are being fooled again that we are primitive. I think we just have to say, no, your construct of primitiveness don't make us primitive. Yeah, we are equal human beings, rich in diversity. And that diversity does not make for inequality. That diversity makes for solidarity and unity.
Thank you. Nev, you got a long question typed in the chat box. Do you want to ask that question?
I think her mic doesn't work.
Okay. Do you want to read it, Claudia?
Okay. It says, I have a question, if that's okay. Apologies, my camera and mic doesn't work. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Shiva. This was really interesting. I thought it was particularly interesting where you said that the rise of industry was a decline of the community. Do you think that declining industry, ironically, can also have the same effect? In the UK, it certainly seems that deindustrialization has been detrimental to former steel and mining towns like mine. Obviously, there are huge disadvantages to these industrial sectors, but such communities used to be largely unionized with some sense of security and purpose. Today, there is so much deprivation and precarious work, and at least it seems to me a distinct lack of community service and spirit. Is this the case, and how can we return to community and project the environment when industrialization has already taken place in an area?
Yeah, you know, so what did industrialization do? Basically, it took the land and the resources of the South and took it to two factory towns, Lancashire and Manchester, where the industrial process run by fossil fuels and coal and the steam engine and the internal combustion system eventually led to communities being reduced to units of labor. And labor was reduced to just the part of you that you can sell on to the factory. Yeah. So it was not just the enclosures of the commons that displaced the peasants from the land, but it was an enclosure of our body as a commons. So just the part that can be used in the factory becomes relevant and then can be exploited. The two things you said, you know, the deindustrialization that has taken place because of globalization and outsourcing and everything going to China has created very deprived communities because they internalized their individual isolation. And They internalized their dependency on selling their labor. They forgot who they were, that they have bodies outside the labor sold as commodity, yeah? That they still have creativity, they still have minds, and the people around them. And the union of industrial workers is one form of community, but there are many, many other ways you become a community. So for example, I have worked with people who lost their jobs in the textile industry, but they came back to the villages and they created community seed banks and they're doing organic farming. And then you relate to each other as a community of growers of food. Yeah. If you look at the opioid crisis in America and England, it is the disenfranchised workers who suffer the worst pain of becoming irrelevant to society. So how can deindustrialization help rebuild community? By allowing people who are treated now as throwaway people as full human beings. You know, if there are disasters in the South with climate change and havoc, there are disasters in the North with throwaway people. And if we can collect it all in a reimagination of the human condition and bring the possibilities to do things together to meet needs, to get your identity, to provide for togetherness. And for me, I have found the garden is the best way. You know, grow your food, that's the highest level of self-reliance and higher level of forming community, because then you know your community with the insects, your community with the earthworms, your community with the soil organisms, and you never feel alone. So I do think for many of you young people, this will be a very important part, not just because of the deindustrialization of globalization, but the technological disposability, where the Zuckerbergs in their Harvard address, he said 99% of humanity will be useless in the world of the future, because the work will be done by artificial intelligence and robots. Now, I do think we all need to imagine a future for the 99% as community and as regenerators of economy and ecology.
You know, there was an interesting comment sort of just on that sort of Melinda Gates talking about farmers and wanting to relieve women from farming because it's back-breaking work. But then, you know, you discuss sort of gardening and sort of going back to that. So what we see is sort of that, I guess, hypocrisy with regards to you know, encouraging sort of Western people to sort of engage in gardening, then telling sort of rural communities that actually farming is almost kind of oppressive in that sense. What are your comments with regards to that?
Yeah, you know, I've had so many, whether it's a BBC or an ABC, and you know, and it's, oh, you're preventing GMOs, Roundup resistant crops that will prevent the back-breaking work of women. You want to exploit women with Roundup and glyphosate, they get liberation. And the ads, I have an ad sitting in my office where Monsanto had an ad with women, their hands tied with greens. You know, that if you manage your own weeds, you are imprisoned. You spray Roundup, you are liberated with poison to get cancer. So these falsehoods are so tragic because they're taking lives. So all these interviews, they'll say, oh, you're keeping GMOs out and Roundup out and, you know, backbreaking work. So I'll just turn around and ask the interviewer, I said, so do you garden? Oh, of course, it's so beautiful. I said, so how come for you, the same work is liberating? And for someone in the South with a 1 acre piece of land, which is like a garden, is backbreaking. Why don't you see your work in your gardens as backbreaking? Why do you see it as liberating? Isn't this duplicity? So it is duplicity. And Melinda's saying this now, but you know, they paid people like Florence Ovambugo in Africa to lead the biotech industry. And she would always get up and say, you know, oh, I grew up on it. She never grew up on a farm, but I grew up on a farm and my Roundup liberated me. There was no Roundup in Africa at that time. But, you know, they just get up and perform this theater. And not only do I see the garden as a very important imaginary of our times. You know how we started redefining gardening and farming? We do a course and it's available on the website, the Yoga of the Earth. Everyone is running to a yoga studio, yeah? Bending your back as a yoga posture is lovely. Our peasant women do yoga every day. You call that backbreaking? For them, it's freedom. And we are releasing a film. It's going to be a beautiful film called Shakti, The Power of Women. And women are saying this. So they go to the studio to learn yoga. I work in my garden to do yoga and also bring food. So I think I have a very simple principle, having been colonized, having, watched and sometimes suffered capitalist patriarchy. Never take the definitions of the oppressor to define who you are and what you live through. True self-reliance is determine your condition, both in terms of your pains and your joys, and find your way in community to find solutions of any problem you face.
There's a question from Abdi Fatah. Thank you, Dr. Shiva. Having said industrialization somehow decline communities' further formations, what is their fate as the whole world is competing to lead different levels of industrialization? Any wake-up call on that?
Well, if you watch the Indian farmers' protests, they were fighting against the globalization and industrialization and corporate takeover of our agriculture. That's what they were fighting against. So it's not the case that there's a, it's just happening and there's no counter. People, every day, people are realizing they have to people have to defend their commons and their community. So I don't think we should look at any of this as a one-way, unstoppable, linear process and a juggernaut. Every process that is historic, every process that is created by men, a few men maybe, powerful men maybe, is still man-made. And anything man-made, the direction can be changed. How it gets changed depends on how people organize. During our freedom movements in all of our countries, people organize for freedom from the empire. Right now, people are organizing sadly in silos and spend more time fighting each other, and finding how, having competitions about is climate more important or extinction? Is hunger more important or the health pandemic? Or, and they're pitted against each other all the time. But we have to see the common condition of us as human beings, divided by colonialism over years, divided by artificial wealth creation, divided by artificially constructed gender divides, divided by race and divided by religion, and then find our unity at a higher level, not giving up our identities, but not letting them become reasons of fissure between us. So I believe that whatever are the destructive forces leading to climate disasters, new poverty, are forces that can be changed, and we will need a new human solidarity and a new earth solidarity. That's why I say the first identity is we are one humanity on one planet. That's our first identity. Every other narrow identity flows from there. And as long as we can hold that first identity, we will find ways. How much longer, Claudia?
We're wrapping up now. So I think that's sort of our sort of last questions, and I'll have sort of Janica wrap up. And I think from all of us, this has been really fantastic to be able to listen from you and learn from you as well. So thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you, and all strength and love to all of you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Vandana Shiva, for this valuable engagement, but also encouraging our students as well as some of our colleagues and students in the university to think beyond the mainstream. I think this session point towards finding our own theories, own approaches beyond the mainstream approaches and theories that's been taught at schools and universities for many years. And I think especially in the global south, there is a much bigger need finding our own theories, our own approaches. I think what you emphasize here is that communities as a collective have the strength and the capacity to deal with uncertainties and dangers And I think from a humanitarian point of view, these where the international humanitarian system needs to learn that they need to take a back seat and let the communities lead them and assist them and work with them as friends. So in that, I conclude the session, and thank you very much again, Dr. Shiva. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.